Hello and welcome to this individual oral code screencast for the course TDDD27, where I will present the code that I've written in my project that I call Second Light. We're gonna go and look at first some non-specific code, and then we're gonna look at the back end quite quickly, and then we're gonna go to the front end, which is the most interesting part of the code. Firstly, we can look at the Docker Compose, which is basically the way I launch my project. And here I have a bunch of different services. For instance, the login server is a specific service that uses a Docker file, and you just launch it using the. We can look at how you launch it, basically. So, because I'm using Docker Compose, I can just say Docker Compose up, and then build here is just to build it, and D is to start the in a daemon thread instead of this window. So I can run this and it will build this for me, which is really handy. It will build everything for me. But if we look at the code for this is just a YAML file where you specify basically everything you need and some environment variables that you will need for some parts of this. So what we can see here is we have a login server, a storage server, the website, the database, some Mongo Express that we can just look at the contents of the database, and all of these just have a port mapping so you can access them locally. We also have a GitLab continuous integration set up here. Again, it's just a YAML file where you specify what you want to do during the continuous integration step. I currently only have two stages, which is build and lint. And in the build we only have the front end building, because I tried to get it work with Docker Compose, but I couldn't get it to work because for some reason Docker Compose was I was stuck on that for like a couple of hours trying to figure out how I could get Docker Compose to work, but then I just gave up after some time. But this will build the front end, and it will lint the front end to check for syntax errors and different things. So that's quite nice. We can look at the back end, which is divided into two servers. We have the login server, and for the login server I use Fast API and super tokens, which is an authentication library basically. So super token does most of the job for me. I just tell it to, here's a Fast API instance and do your thing. So there's just an init function where you have to point super tokens to the super tokens core, which is like in between the server and the database basically. And you tell it which framework you're using, and you have to specify which parts of the super tokens library you want to use. I would use the session and the third-party email password part. And for the third-party things, you have to specify which providers you want, and most providers have some kind of client keys that you have to specify in an environment, and I use an environment variables to handle that part. And that's basically the login server. It's not really that interesting. We can look at the storage server, which is a bit more interesting. In this case, it's still a Fast API server, and we have some routers, which is just a way to divide the routes that are similar to each other into different files. And we have to do some super tokens initial setup here as well, just because if you want to use the session management that comes with super tokens, you want to validate that the user has a valid session when they access a route. You have to point super tokens to where can I figure out if this session is valid. And there's just some coarse middleware which is not that interesting. Some database setups which is again not that interesting. We have some AWS things. I used the library Boto3 to get to access AWS in an AWS S3 instance, and with that I can then generate pre-signed URLs, which is just URL where you basically generate a key, a URL which you can use for a limited amount of time to access some files. So if you generate a pre-signed put URL, you get a URL where you can upload an image for the next 100 seconds. And after that, the URL is no longer valid. So you get the URL where you can upload, and then that URL is no longer valid. So. And then we can go into the routes, which is the main part, which you specify a route like this, and you can specify a prefix if you want, which is quite nice. And then this route becomes then get a user. So it adds the prefix to what you specify here, so it's get user, basically. And then this part just accesses the database to find the user with this user ID. And this is basically how you require a session on the user. So basically we say that this depends on the result, that it's a valid session. And there's just basically a bunch of routes that do different things. And for the widget route, it's basically the same thing. It's just the prefix is widget, and the code is obviously a bit different, but it's basically just a bunch of routes that does different things and handle different things. We also have models, because Fast API uses Pydantic to manage. We can specify a response model, and then it will convert any dictionary you return to that model and then convert it to JSON, which is quite handy. But then you also have to specify how does these models look like. So there are a bunch of classes here that are just Pydantic models, or inherit from the Pydantic base model, and just add new fields. The only really somewhat interesting thing here is JSON doesn't really support a way to handle object IDs, which are used in MongoDB. So this is basically a solution to handle that part, where you in the response models, look at one here. We use object ID string, and in the input models we used PyObjectID, which means that when we get something, we treat it as a string and then convert it to an object ID. So on the server we're treating it as an object ID, but to and from the server we're treating it as a string. And this object ID string basically takes an object ID and then converts it back to a string. This means that I don't have to manually change these things and manually convert object IDs back to strings and to and forth, which is became quite a hassle when I initially started. That's basically it for the backend part. Now we can look a bit on the front-end part, which might be a bit more interesting. I used Vue for this part, and let's look at and then you have a public folder, which is basically a way to access things that you want to share publicly. So this is just a icon and a background image that I use for this site. Not that interesting. We have this is basically the way you access the app is through this index.html, where we import this main TypeScript file, which is just this, and this part is where Vue gets involved in the process. So the first interesting part here is this part where we import what is called a plugin, and this part where we use the plugin. So we can look at the plugin first. So to create a plugin, you just basically have to have an object or a function that has a property install, which takes an app, and I think it could also take options here as well, but I don't use it for this part, so they're not really needed. And this part is just a server connection where we create two Axios instances, I think they're called. It doesn't really matter. One for the storage server and one for the login server. And then we add the super tokens Axios interceptors, which basically means we allow super tokens to before we send the request, super tokens might add cookies and other things to the request in order to authenticate the user. And then we initialize super tokens, where to find authentication. And then we do this app provide, which is basically a dependency injection pattern that you can use in Vue, where you may provide something and then inject it where you need it. So that's really nice, because then we don't have to create new Axios instances, and that also means that we can reuse, because if we create a new Axios instance, then it would have a different Axios or super tokens interceptor, and then it would treat cookies differently, and it would be a problem. So we want one Axios instance where we have this super tokens interceptor, and this is a really neat way to do that. As I said, you provide and then you inject. One interesting thing is with TypeScript that inject returns an object or undefined, and for some things that might not really be what you want. You need it to return something, otherwise the service is not really usable. Like if you can't connect to the server, what's the point? We might as well crash. And this is basically what this helper does, where we inject something, and if it's undefined, we throw an error. So this is just called inject strict because of that. Then we can look at the app, which is like the main app. We use refs for reactive state, so we just have for instance, a logged in variable, which just tells the user, are you logged in or not, which is fair enough. We can look at and I also use the composition API for Vue, where you can separate the script content, the template content, and the style content, which is quite nice, because then we can just look at the template here to begin with. So we basically have an authentication form where you can log in and sign up and do different things, and we use the if Vue if, it's not Vue, but Vue the library if. So we want to show this component if the user is not logged in. Fair enough. And then we also have base widgets, which I will explain a bit later. But basically we use the Vue for directive, where we can specify a list and tell Vue to loop through this list and create a base widget for each item in this list, which is a really neat way to reduce code duplication and to do reactive things with list components. So basically it uses this part where we store the widget IDs as an array of strings, and then it goes through that array of strings, and for each ID then creates a base widget. And there's also a sidebar menu where you, if you're logged in, show this sidebar menu to the user, where you can do different things. There's a bunch of functions here as well. Some of them are not that interesting. Just check if the user is logged in or not, by attempting to refresh the session, and if that works, then they're logged in, and we can get the user data from the storage server. There's some code about background images, which is not that interesting. You can log out, which is again not that interesting. Let's have a look. One thing that's a bit interesting maybe is how to handle third-party authentication if you only have a single page application, which is what I have. It was a bit tricky to figure out how to do this, so I decided to add a parameter to the URL when you are signing up using a third party. So if you have the third party ID equals something in the URL, then I know that you have just signed in using a third party source, and then I can handle that separately and then redirect you back to the website. We can have a look and see how that works maybe, because so basically I press this button and it adds a third party ID to the user, and then it logs you in, which is a bit interesting. We also a big part is being able to provide props to components, to child components basically, and then being able to listen to events or emits, I think they're basically called in Vue, from the child component. So these at log out is basically us listening to an emit, and colon here is basically specifying this prop should be this. So if the sidebar menu says the user wants to log out, we call the logout function. Simple as that. And then we can basically look at some of our components, which is one of this is the sidebar menu, which then takes these bunch of props, which is one is username, and then two of those are connected to background images, and then we define which events are able to be emitted by this widget, and then there's basically, we use watches here to check or to monitor changes in some of the props, to say if the available background images have changed, we want to refetch the URLs. And this is basically because remember from the backend part, you have to get a valid URL to be able to access an image. So if we get a new available image, we need to fetch a URL from where we can fetch the image. And then we also have some ways to toggle a drop-down menu, which we then use in the template part of the code. And there's also some code about how to being able to select a file and then uploading it, but that's not really that interesting. So basically this is how you how I did this in the template part, where you have a button, for instance, and on click we toggle the drop down called profile, which is this part below, and this has a view if directive where we say if dropdowns.profile is active, then we want to show this part. This part contains an input and a button as well, but so basically this is a repeated pattern across this sidebar menu. We have a button and it toggles a drop down, and then if that drop down is active, we show this div part. We could also look at the authentication part of the code. Maybe we should have done that before, but doesn't really matter. So the authentication form is basically what's shown to the user if you're not logged in. And here I use the concept of tabs in Vue, where you have a dynamic component where you specify the is directive, and that specifies whether it's a sign-in form or a sign-up form. And here we also use the keep alive tag to specify that when this tab goes out of scope, it should not be, the contents of it should not be deleted, which means that I can write something in this email form, change to the sign up page, go back, and this what I wrote here still remains, which is quite neat. And then we can look at, for instance, the sign-in form, which just has a way to, or has any. We can look at the template first, maybe. That's a bit interesting. So it basically has a few third-party sign-in options, and then it has your email address or your password and a submit button, which is basically it. And then we have a way to store that email and password in the TypeScript code. I don't know if I said this earlier, but we use the vmodel directive to do that, where we just specify we have a variable called email, which we're gonna bind to the value that is available in this input. So that's basically how you do this, and you can also bind different attributes as well. So here we bind style attribute of this input to the input style variable or reactive reactive function, basically. And the yeah, that's not really interesting. One thing you can also do is use something called computed in Vue, which is where you itself is not reactive, but some part of the code that you use in it are. So this error variable is a reactive variable that is either true or false, right? Because it's a boolean. And then if this error value changes, then this input style value is also changed. So we basically compute the input style based on the reactive value of error. So if there's an error, we add a border. Simple as that. This file is not really that interesting. It's a bit of error management, where we have a bunch different errors based on what the user enters, so that if you enter an invalid email, an email that already exists, an invalid username, an invalid password, the confirmation password, we have to enter the password twice, doesn't match, we want to explain this to the user. And that's basically what we're doing a lot of this file, where we have the error text is based on the value of the error reactive component variable, And if it's basically an invalid email, we show that the email is not valid to the user. Makes sense. We can go to the heart of the application basically, which is what's the base widget. So the base widget is basically, this is the container that supports a widget inside of it, and it also handles most of the logic that is that all widgets need to handle. So it's a way to reduce some code duplication. And this basically has a few reactive, quite a few reactive variables, and a bunch, and some of these are connected to the widget itself, where we have the widget container, for instance, which is a ref to the container that holds the widget, and this then is a resizable container, and we save the size of this container in the database, so that if you resize it, it's then saved in the database. Some of the interesting things here are the fact that we use a tab-like syntax here as well, where we define the type of the widget, and then in here use a dynamic component that is the type of this widget. So we load the widgets from the database, and the database stores which type of widget this is, and then we dynamically load which widget to show. There's also some other parts of the code here where we actually have an outer container, and then some other parts. This is, for instance, the top banner, where we use the mouse down event to be able to drag a container, or be able to, this like top part is where you drag around widgets, which is and for this we use the .self add-on. I'm not sure what it's actually called, but where this means that it only works if you press the DOM component itself and not child components, which makes buttons not be, you can't press the button and also drag it, which would be kind of strange. That's pretty much the interesting part of that. There's also some for loops here where you can we go through the different options you have when defining a settings for a widget, and we do this with a view for loop, just to simplify code duplication. There is a bit of code here about loading and saving widgets to the database. Not that interesting. We just do a GET request and then update the values corresponding to what we want to use. We can take a look at something interesting. This is basically how I define which widgets are available, where I just import the different widgets, add them to an object that is then used by view in the tabs formatting. This widget settings part is just a way to be able to define which settings are changeable by the user for this specific widget. And the widget settings are the current settings, and the widget settings options are which options are available to change. We can look at the clock widget, which is quite simple, but it basically explains this settings part, where you basically define these are the options available for you to change in this widget. So you can change the font size to these 3 different values, and the font family to these 3, and so forth, so on and so forth. And then, because we pass settings as a prop, we then can compute the style off of these settings as just prop settings style, and then we can just apply this style to the content of the widget. That's mostly it. There are other widgets that all have similar-ish syntax. They have the same kind of props where you can have, and the same emits where you can save content, load content, and some defines where we supply initial conditions to the parent component. For instance, this search widget where you can change which search engine you want to use, where you can use Google, DuckDuckGo, or Bing, for instance, and this is then changeable by the user. I think that is mostly it with interesting things. So I will stop it right there.